Okay, let me put up the slides, and off we are. All right. Hello, everyone. I cannot see my own slides. That's a problem. That's a problem. Hang on a second. I need to actually make sure that I can see my own slides. There we go. There we go. That works. Okay, so sorry for that little glitch here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening for all of you all over the world. And thank you for joining us for this webinar on IPCC's 1.5 degree report and the critical opportunities that the social sciences have to help shape that report and more broadly the future. We have had an unbelievable response to this webinar, and I'm just so delighted that you could all join us. My name is Susi Moser. I am a senior advisor to ISSC's Transformations to Sustainability program, and I am also a member of the Scientific Steering Committee of IPCC's 1.5 degree report, which I will explain shortly. So I just want to set a little bit of the stage for our webinar, introduce our speakers, and then open up for a conversation among all of us. So let me just, before we get started, quickly say that we will record this webinar. Given the great interest that we've had from all over the world, probably some people have decided not to join in the middle of the night. So I will just simply, hit the record button so that we can share it with them later. And here's the agenda for what we want to do. I'm going to just speak for a few minutes to set the context and tell you a little bit about the IPCC process to date. We then have 4 individuals who have been part of the process to date: Petra, Tschakert, Geels, Ioan Fazey, and Bronwyn Hayward, who will share a little bit about their experience of being part of that process. And then open up to your questions and a panel discussion amongst the panelists as to how we in the social sciences can best contribute to that report. And then also offer a few suggestions of how you all can contribute to the IPCC process going forward. So let me start with a little bit of an overview of the process that has brought us to this point. Many of you are familiar, of course, with the Paris Agreement, which set a goal, highlighted here in yellow, of limiting the global temperature increase to well below 2 degrees, hopefully to no more than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And when that was agreed, there was basically a suggestion or an invitation made by the UNFCCC to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, to prepare a report of what we know about the impacts of 1.5 degrees versus higher levels and what the possible pathways might be to get to 1.5 degrees. From that, the IPCC had to accept that invitation, basically, and it did that early in April 2016 this year, and then formed a scientific steering committee, ISSC, that is made up of the chairs of the working group 1, 2, and 3, and the technical, what is it? Now I just forgot the abbreviation, but it's basically the inventory of greenhouse gas emissions. There's a technical support unit, and its co-chairs are included. And as you can see, this is a picture of those individuals. Selma Krug, the vice chair of the IPCC, is chairing that committee. And what they found very quickly is they do not have enough social science and human sciences representation on that committee. And so they invited the ISSC to offer a representative, and the humanities also to offer a representative to join the scientific steering committee. And so this is how I got involved and how Marie-Hélène Parisot got involved in this otherwise very IPCC heavy co-chaired steering committee. Once we got together, we basically were charged with looking through the nominations for a scoping meeting and selecting the experts. There was a questionnaire sent out both to the country focal points but really beyond to the world of what should be covered in such a report. We developed a background paper that framed up what the challenges are that one might look at in such a report in advance of the scoping meeting. And then we prepared the agenda, and I want to say really not just an agenda but a process for how to most effectively bring 120 people together and come up with a report in 3 days' time. So we then had that scoping meeting in Geneva in August, and that is where our panelists were all involved. And from that, we developed an outline from that, and that was then discussed at the most recent session of the panel. Its 44th session in October in Bangkok, and revised, as you will see in a moment, and approved. And that now is the outline that will guide the writing of the special report. In Bangkok, it was also agreed to call this report Global Warming of 1.5 degrees, at least as a short title, short catchy title. The longer title is far more involved, and nobody in their right mind will be able to ever say that in full length. So it is now known as the Global Warming of 1.5 degree report. Let me briefly highlight that in Bangkok there were some really intense negotiations as to what should be covered, and I will explain to you or show to you in a moment of what the resulting changes were in the outline. One big item of conversation is whether there simply is enough relevant literature, because as you know, the IPCC always has to draw on published literature. It does not do its own research. There was a big discussion over the inclusion of a chapter on sustainability, poverty eradication, and equity issues, and embedded within that whether or not to use the terms equity and ethics as the expert in Geneva decided would be appropriate. A discussion as to whether or not to really deliberately point out the possible need for negative emissions and geoengineering. And then maybe the longest and most intense conversation about whether or not there is a big enough difference between chapters 4 and 5, as I'll point out in a moment. They're about where we could intervene to make these radical shifts in emissions in particular, and then chapter 5, which was oriented toward what we know about implementation of these options. So here are the comparison of outlines, just so you have a sense of what happened in the shift. On the left hand here you see the outline that was agreed in Geneva by the experts that were invited to the scoping meeting, with a framing chapter, a chapter on the mitigation pathways, basically that would be compatible with 1.5 degrees. There's more than one way to get there. The impacts of 1.5 on both natural and human systems. As you can see in this outline, it is the heaviest of the chapters. At chapter 4 on the opportunities for strengthening the global response to the threat of climate change to get to 1.5 degrees, and then chapter 5, the approaches to implementing that. And then finally a chapter that would sort of close the loop from the framing of the chapter that is all about doing these kinds of changes in the context of sustainable development, poverty eradication, and reducing inequalities, with a number of case study boxes and frequently asked questions. And the changes that you see here on the right is basically the approved outline that came out of Bangkok, with a shortened summary for policymakers, an integrated chapter, no longer chapters 4 and 5, but one integrated chapter which together is about 50 pages as opposed to the 60 pages previously between the two chapters, a shortened chapter on sustainable development, poverty eradication, and reducing inequalities. There are much more finer details to that. If we want to, we can get to it, but that's basically the overarching change to the outline. And very quickly, a word on how this now moves forward. You can see the orange line or red line that goes all the way through. That is where we are right now. The red dot just before it was the approval of that outline. And what follows from now to the approval of the final report is not quite 2 years, and it has to include a call for authors, a decision on those authors, 4 author meetings with expert reviews in between. It is an incredibly condensed timeline of how quickly this has to happen. So this is basically how we're going to get to a final report by the fall of 2018. Now, before I tell you more about how you can all contribute, let me actually turn it here and introduce our speakers who will speak a little bit about their experience of being part of this process. So we will first hear from Petra Tschakert, who is professor at the School of Earth and Environment at the University of Western Australia. She's a geographer and applied anthropologist by training and focuses broadly on human-environment interactions, more specifically rural livelihoods, environmental change, marginalization, social learning, and societal transformation. Then we're going to hear from Geels, who is Professor of System Innovation and Sustainability at the Sustainable Consumption Institute at the University of Manchester. He is trained in Science and Technology and Innovation Studies and currently serves as the chair of the International Sustainability Transitions Research Network. He's one of the world's leading scholars on socio-technical transition. Then we will hear from Ioan Fazey. He's chair of the Social Dimensions of Environmental Change at the University of Dundee in Scotland. He describes himself as an interdisciplinary researcher focused on human and environmental relationships through the lens of valuation, learning, the role of inter- and transdisciplinary research in fostering sustainability. He also works on vulnerability, adaptation and transformation, and governance questions. And then last but not least, we will hear from Bronwyn Hayward, who is the director, well, she's actually the head of the Department of Political Science and International Relations at the University of Canterbury, but also director of the Sustainable Citizenship and Civic Imagination Program. She researches citizenship and sustainability with a particular focus on children and youth in rapidly changing physical and socioeconomic environments. So you can see we have not only a very friendly bunch, but a very diverse bunch of people who will join us this morning. And so, Petra, at this point, I will just turn it over to you.
Thank you, Susi, for the introduction. I think I'm unmuted. So hello, everybody. Welcome to this webinar. This is a fantastic opportunity to share our experiences within this process so far and hopefully lay out some trajectories for the next 2 years to come. So as Susi said, I'm a geographer by training, a human environment geographer, and I was fortunate enough to be I was coordinating lead author on Chapter 13 in the IPCC 5th Assessment Report, Working Group 2. And at that point, we looked at a new chapter in the IPCC called Livelihoods and Poverty. I was also fortunate enough to be part of the summary for policymakers as well as the technical summary of Working Group 2 and finally the synthesis report that brings major findings from all 3 working groups together. Now, this experience in Geneva, which was the scoping meeting for the 1.5 degree report, for me was a new experience. I had not been part of a scoping meeting before. I had seen these outlines because, of course, we used such outlines for the 5th assessment report, but it was nonetheless fascinating to see how these outlines, the titles for the chapters, the number of chapters, and the bullet points underneath each chapter come together. So I think, overall, I was enormously impressed with the Scientific Steering Committee. I think they all did an absolutely outstanding job to encourage all the participants. I think we were over 80 participants from various countries, various backgrounds, to shape the structure and the framing of the special report. There was no pre-negotiated or preferred outline, except for one person who just couldn't help himself. But the first 2 days and the first rounds of breakout groups were really, really instrumental in painting what the collective wanted to be or saw as the most useful and balanced structure. And so it was only on day 3, actually, that we started to think about chapters and possible content. So let me just tell you briefly what I was involved in during these 4 days in Geneva. I was asked, like other people as well who are here today, to give what was called a scene-setting presentation. Given the fact that I had been part of the 5th assessment report, I was asked to comment on adaptation in the context of sustainable development, poverty eradication, and food insecurity. And I think here the findings from the 5th assessment report were really helpful. And clearly climate change is a threat to equitable and sustainable development because it simply exacerbates livelihood struggles, especially among disadvantaged populations. But we also know that averages, 1.5 or 2 or higher, always mask disproportional impacts. And we know that critical thresholds do not emerge from crossing any kind of global average. So the need to pay more attention to invisible, intangible impacts, experience on the ground that are not necessarily reflected in meteorological data in climate stations across the world was fundamental in this scene-setting presentation. The way the entire scoping meeting evolved was, as I said earlier, to move from brainstorming on what should be in the chapters, how the framing should be constructed, whether or not we wanted a framing that starts with biophysical impacts or biophysical observations in the climate system, impacts, and then further down the line, ramifications for societies, people, and development, or if we wanted a framing that started very clearly with highlighting the mandate of this special report, which was to be and still is in the context of sustainable development, poverty eradication, and food security. And we did opt for a framing that starts clearly with sustainable development and ends with sustainable development. And I think this is a major achievement both of the Geneva negotiations and conversations, but also of the approval session in Bangkok. I was involved in group discussions also on impacts, but most importantly from day 3 onwards, in leading smaller group discussions on how such a chapter on sustainable development and poverty eradication could look like. And out of this meeting that was very diverse, people from the global north, global south, men, women, social scientists, biophysical scientists, came a strong consensus that such a chapter would be fundamental, would be needed, should be a standalone chapter, and I think the meeting in Bangkok simply underlined, underscored that high importance. In the end, the chapter was cut from 40 pages to 20 pages. I don't see as any major disaster. Looking back again at my IPCC AR5 experience, where we had a chapter of 25 pages, and knowing that it took us 4 years to write it, I think 20 chapters is probably just as manageable. The fact that equity and ethics is no longer one of the sub-bullets as proposed from Geneva, I think is also not a major disaster. We still have reducing inequalities in the title, which I think is the more important point. And reducing inequalities, as many of you I'm sure know, is also a sustainable development goal. It's number 10. And so having that in the title gives a lot of freedom to authors to talk about inequalities and trade-offs between achieving a 1.5 upper limit of warming and sustainable development at the same time, and that inevitably includes issues of equity and uneven power relations. And I think if we want to close the arc from chapter 1, the framing chapter, to chapter 6, and throughout the other chapters, paying attention to ramifications for societies, development, and so on, I think the outline as it is approved right now is very promising, and certainly gives a lot of leeway to authors to look up the best available science to populate these chapters. I'll turn it over, and Frank is next.
Great. Thank you so much. Frank, I'm just making you the presenter.
Okay, thank you, Susi. Just trying to upload the slides. Is anything happening, Sarah?
Right now we're seeing your email.
I can see your screen, exactly your email.
Is that better?
Yes.
There you go. Yep.
Good.
Okay. Well, I'll try to make it brief. I just made some slides with some reflections on the IPCC process. I've never been in the IPCC, so it was an interesting experience for me. I was involved in chairing the meetings on Chapter 4, the strengthening of the global response. So my general impressions was that there was quite a struggle going on between different communities, different academic communities, which I think relates to the character of the special report, which is moving a bit from the problem of climate change to more the solution side, and particularly the question, can we accelerate the global response? I do think the whole IPCC, I mean, they have been very courageous in bringing in more of the social sciences, but for me there was quite a struggle going on between two communities. One is the traditional IPCC sciences, the modeling and the climate natural sciences, which I think tends to focus on the problem and a little bit on the solution. They tend to have a more positivist view or philosophy of science based on models and quantitative. They tend to focus on the physical dimensions and the techno-economic dimensions. On the other hand, you have the social sciences, which are more focused on solutions. There were quite a few people from the transitions community and the transformations community who tend to work from different philosophies of science, which range all the way from more positivist approaches to interpretive to critical realist approaches. And they tend to focus on a wider range of social dynamics. So technical and economic remain important, but they also look at the social cultural dynamics, political dimensions, and also conflict. And there was quite a bit of getting to know each other going on at the IPCC conference, and also sometimes a bit of labeling of the other community. So in the plenary meeting there was some labeling going on from the natural scientists, claiming that they were the ones doing objective, sound science, that they were unbiased, and that the social sciences were normative, prescriptive and subjective. So these are some of the things you have to struggle with as a social scientist, or maybe when two communities try to work together. And I think the IPCC process is very interesting in this respect itself. I was responsible for drafting and facilitating the communication on Chapter 4, which was called Strengthening the Global Response, and has now been merged with implementation. I think some of the bullet point text that we have ended up with, probably for understandable reasons, is a bit formulated in rather abstract managerial language. So there's lots of talk about options and deployment and systems and structures and levers of change. And there's a tendency, I think, to focus or to assess dynamics in techno-economic dimensions. So the cost, the benefit, finance, price, performance. So this is, I think, the normal, or the traditional way of thinking. I think a challenge for this special report will be also for the social sciences in particular, to not only focus on structures and systems, but obviously as a social scientist we also want to focus on actors. So who are actually the people doing things or hindering things? So we'll have to look at businesses, consumers, policymakers, cities, civil society actors, but also the motivations of actors, interests, beliefs, identities, social networks, and of course change processes, learning, capabilities, resources, meanings, social acceptance, but also power and politics, and also resistance against change. So these things are not so visible in the current bullet points, but I think this will be important to bring out in the whole report, but particularly in Chapter 4. Because if you want to strengthen the global response, of course the question is who is going to do it and what are the core drivers of that process. So I think one challenge is then to, as for the social sciences at least, is to bring in broader kind of ontologies. There is a tendency to work only from the sort of economic paradigm, which is in the bottom left corner, which assumes that reality is objective and is only constituted by individuals which give them preferences. But of course the social sciences have got a much broader range of assumptions in thinking about how the world actually works. So you've got a whole long tradition going to Marx and others which understands conflict and power, and those are seen as the drivers of change. You also have structuralist traditions, which look more at taking for granted beliefs and discourses and meanings. These are really important as drivers according to some social science theories. And then of course there's a whole tradition of interpretation and sense making and construction of meaning more on the ground. And none of them have got a patent on truth. They all highlight different important dimensions of the real world. And I think that this will be one challenge, I think, in the special report, to make sure that not only the economic voice is there, but also some of the other social sciences. And I think the second challenge is to deal with scales and levels. I think there's an understandable tendency in the report and the IPCC more generally to focus on the global level, because ultimately climate change is a global problem. And much of the tradition has been to focus on the UN and international negotiations, so it's quite understandable that the global level tends to be privileged. But that does lead to a view of change which is kind of slow and gradual, because you just average all the dynamics out at the global level. So a challenge for this report will be to look also what's going on other scalar levels, the level of countries, the level of sectors, the level of cities, local projects and communities. And there's a risk that if you ignore that, if you only focus on the global level, that you actually miss a lot of the dynamics that are currently going on in the real world. And some of those examples actually offer instances of fast change. Some countries are moving fast, some cities are moving fast, and they help you understand nonlinear change. But there will be a real challenge, I think, in the report to bring in multiscalar dynamics and how to acknowledge all the dynamics that is going on in cities, but then also ask how can this possibly scale up and influence dynamics at the global and the national level. So this is a challenge, I think, that has not yet been fully solved. Then the last two slides are, chapter 4 is about strengthening the global response. Obviously, everyone knows something needs to change because we're not on the right path. So we need much stronger policies. I think we need stronger innovation policies, broadly understood stronger environmental policies. These are regulations, taxes and subsidies, and much stronger development policies. And there is a tendency to focus on innovation and maybe a bit on development, but there's quite a bit of reluctance and resistance to talk about strengthening the selection environment, so tougher regulations and taxes and subsidies. But more importantly maybe is that if we want to speed up the global response, that is not only about the policies, but more deeper, that's of course about the political will to influence these policies. And I think as a social scientist, of course political science has studied this for decades and decades. It's not simply the case that we need heroic policymakers or politicians who will do it on their own. We need to understand where this political will comes from. And that means looking at a whole range of facilitating contexts, which is clearly, of course, international pressure and the agreements like Paris, but it also requires pressure from civil society and public discourse. We need pressure from business coalitions, working exemplars on the ground so we can overcome skepticism. We need to develop a positive discourse, so the attempt to talk about co-benefits and green growth and jobs and quality of life is already going in that direction. And probably there needs to be bottom-up pressure as well, so policymakers need to be pressured by cities and communities and green entrepreneurs. So I think the real challenge for this report will be to make sure that the wealth of insights from the social sciences, that they will find a place in this report, and that of course the technical and the economic dimensions remain important, but particularly if we want to understand the strengthening of the global response, we need to have a broader understanding which looks at the interactions also of civil society, business and politics. So I think that the discussion in Geneva and in Bangkok were very encouraging, and I think this is where the social sciences can really make new contributions to the kind of existing way of doing things, and I think that the chances look very good for this report to do that. So those were my reflections.
Great, thank you so much, Frank. I'm going to transition over to Ioan, and in the meantime, just want to briefly remind all of ourselves to be as brief as we can, but also that we are tracking the questions that are coming in, and we will use as much time that remains after our initial comments to answer those. And if not, if we don't get to all of them, we will make comments in writing afterwards on the ISSC website, so we can still answer those later. And with that, Ioan Fazey.
Great, thanks. I'm having some problems getting the screen up and running. Sarah, can you bring up the slides for me? I'll try again. Sarah, is it possible to bring up the slides?
Have we lost her?
No, it's just that I was muted. It always takes a moment. I'm bringing up your slides now.
Great, thank you.
Great. Okay, you should be... Go ahead.
Is that okay?
Yep.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. Thank you. Yeah, so thanks, welcome everybody. It's very good to hear you all in the background somewhere, wherever you may be. So my experience of the IPCC, I'd not formally been involved in the IPCC previously, so this was a new experience for me, but a very interesting one in terms of the nature of the negotiations and how the negotiations took place. Much has been said already by Petra and Frank about that, so I won't add too much more into that and go straight into the talk. So next slide, please, Sarah. So yeah, I mean, I kind of went into the process with not a particular agenda as particularly, but with a particular message that I was trying to put across. I was asked to give one of the keynote presentations about implementation pathways, and really the point that I was making was that climate change is real. It's something that's going to change everything. Whether we meet the goal of 1.5 degrees or we don't meet the goal of 1.5 degrees, significant change is going to happen. So really the ultimate question of how we move forward is how do we accelerate the learning about making deliberate change happen? We're in a space now where that's really, really critical. And that kind of starts to change the way and perhaps in which we think about what we would focus on and what the role of social sciences might be in that process. Next slide, please. So really that kind of is highlighted in this slide here where we've got the traditional kind of questions around understanding a problem or identifying solutions, and they've often tended to be the kind of the sort of more traditional domain of science. These lead to questions around what needs to change, in what way does change need to happen. But really the critical question that comes about where we are at the moment, given the rapidity of change that's needed and the extent of the change that's needed to meet a 1.5 degrees world, is really how do we put these solutions into practice. So this question of implementation, the how-to questions become really, really important. And science in general has not tended to be that great at kind of focusing on that question. It's very good at identifying problems and solutions, but has not really traditionally focused as much in putting solutions into practice. That's considered to be the domain of practice, and therefore it requires us to learn and draw insights out from that domain of practice itself. Next slide, please. So really my experience, very similar to Frank, was that it kind of highlighted that the process in the IPCC, although it's extremely well run and well managed, was really kind of struggling with kind of what the nature and role of science might be in this process as we move into a different kind of set of questions that sort of fit the position that we're now in. And that kind of notion, the credibility of science is assumed to depend on its ability to be objective, but that kind of limits engagement with questions around how to make change happen in the same way that Frank was talking about in terms of issues around trying not to be prescriptive and so on. So there was considerable debate around the extent to which the process could be prescriptive. So for example, there was a lot of conversation, debate about a difference between identifying options versus exploring approaches. If we go down the route of exploring approaches, is that moving too far into the world of prescription, and therefore does that reduce the credibility of the process itself? And then, as Frank has also highlighted, there were some considerable misunderstandings about the nature of social sciences, including in terms of how it might be thought as being rigorous. So for example, you might be able to be rigorous about capturing the subjective understandings of people, but that was sometimes misunderstood as being a subjective process in itself. So I think there was a lot of kind of conversations around that, which really highlighted some of the challenges that we're dealing with in terms of how do we move into this sort of different space of thinking about world of practice and implementation and approaches and so on. Next slide, please. So if I go back to the same slide again, really what we start seeing, this is very similar to Frank's kind of work, is that a lot of the work that's the traditional work around understanding problems and identifying solutions often focuses on evidence from past studies. It often focuses on modeling for future pathways, but really the kinds of things that we're having to move into now to accelerate learning about making change happen has to focus on innovation, learning by doing, and those sorts of things. And they don't tend to fit very well in the kinds of traditions of reports that are available and the kinds of information that they produce. So again, it's how do we move into and capture this kind of different kind of world that's out there in terms of the world of practice, and that kind of poses some interesting challenges. Next slide, please. And I think just to highlight that a little bit further, it kind of really got me thinking about, well, where do we actually fit in this world? If we're trying to base all of our decisions on really hard evidence, then what does that mean in terms of how we get to a rapid, to implementing a rapid change in a world that is complex? And so the evidence-based perspective might be considered to be something as viewing time as the future coming from what has already been. But what we are moving towards in the future has to be very different from what we've had in the past. So is it appropriate to look at the past as a source of information for what that future might be? So it's a bit, potentially an evidence-based approach is a bit like driving forward while looking in the rear-view mirror, potentially. Whereas we've got to sort of shift things over a little bit towards viewing time as flowing from what is coming to the present. The time that we have left in order to make significant action to get to a 1.5 degree world is rapidly declining and getting smaller. So thinking about how we engage with that future and how it comes to the present will be really important. And that kind of highlights again this need to focus on learning, innovation, creativity and imagination. And that will be a critical part of not just the social sciences but the arts and the humanities, and how we bring that into this report. Next slide, please. And then finally, really, this kind of really got me thinking in relation to where does this all fit, and where does the process fit in relation to these kind of challenges that we're dealing with. And it reminded me of Graham Lester, who in 2015 presented an idea of 3 emergencies that relates to other things as well as climate change, but really sort of fits the situation that we are in with climate change at the moment. There is a real emergency. It's something that where we need to get rapid action and significant action very quickly. There's a conceptual emergency, how do we kind of understand these sort of challenges? But there's an existential emergency where even questions about how we deal with knowledge and how we engage with different forms of knowledge, what it means to know something, how we come to know something really matters. And I think that's a kind of critical challenge for this next IPCC report if it really wants to be able to engage in the questions about making change happen and accelerating learning about change. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Ioan. That's great. And Bronwyn, I just switch it over to you. I'm not sure you have presentations or slides. Wait.
And everyone, from the middle of the night here, so you'll forgive me if I'm fairly brief. So this was also my first IPCC experience, and as a political scientist and a geographer, and also from a past background here in New Zealand with broadcasting regulation and commission, I was very interested going into this meeting because, as the speakers have already touched on, we were thinking about the problem from different schools of thought and thinking about how we can ensure that we offer robust knowledge and strong arguments in a very short space of time on a very difficult issue across lots of disciplinary boundaries. And before we started, there'd been a lot of media debate and discussion, and also discussion in scientific journals and in letters about some key issues like why. There's still a lot of debate about why 1.5. You made the kind comment about us being diverse, but of course as a panel we are not diverse. We are European. What was really striking about the meeting, I think Jakob Mogeta and Joshri Roy really stressed the fact that this 1.5 means a huge significant change in focus for developing countries and for particular, as some of the speakers have already said, local communities. But the other question that was already in the public domain before we began was how will we know if we are even at 1.5 or if we have passed it? There were other political debates. Is this a distraction from other core issues, focusing on 2 degrees or more? Will this discussion be captured by carbon capture and technology? Will we end up with a kind of a heroic technological solutions that divert us from meaningful, deeper social, economic and political change? And our language. So it was striking to some of the scientists that we didn't talk often in this meeting, even in the build-up, about questions of energy consumption and demand. We were talking more around the questions of consumer production, and I think these are the same issues, but it's important, as everyone said, to remember what we all know as a community is interdisciplinary research and working with communities on difficult, really complex, wicked problems is hard. And I think what I came away with from IPCC was also a very strong sense of the professionalism of colleagues internationally. This was a big risk for the IPCC to open up to new bodies of knowledge. It's not easy. It was, there were difficult debates. We were doing a lot of very significant connecting across bodies of theory, ways of ensuring research is valid and robust in a very short space of time. So my role had been to just chair the breakout discussion group of the ill-fated Chapter 5, which has been merged into Chapter 4. And to be honest, I think that was actually quite a good idea, because I was worrying about how we would cover, how we would have 2 chapters that had distinct but related bodies of material, and I'd heard from colleagues who've worked before that can be very difficult. So while I'm disappointed that we've got a reduced opportunity to think about implementation, I think it will be easier to discuss it in one chapter. And for authors who are thinking about writing for this as social scientists, there's just a couple of things I'd like to highlight before we open up for discussion. The original discussion in our scoping meeting in Geneva, in our Chapter 5, we've looked at approaches to implementing a strengthened global response in the threat of climate change. And as Frank and Ioan have mentioned, there is a need to be sensitive to the arguments of not being policy prescriptive, but being policy relevant. And I think for social scientists, when you're writing and when we're thinking about these issues, when you work in politics, you are less concerned about actually debating the normative arguments. But in this context, we are thinking about what are the policy relevant information. So we, in our discussions, had highlighted 3 issues we'd like to see in this final report. One is a focus on existing policies, institutions and actions that could be taken. Our second focus had been on options for implementing far-reaching and rapid change, the implications for an enabling environment, and what levels of integration and action we should take, and then some case studies at all levels, from the local to the international, for implementation, and in different circumstances, and the lessons that we could learn for scaling up for rapid and significant change. Now, when we look at what's happened to the new Chapter 4, I'm hopeful that the themes are still within there. The call for authors will focus around these themes about the strengthening and implementing the global response. But beneath that global response, there is assessing the current and emerging adaptation and mitigation options. What synergies and trade-offs do we have for adaptation? What's the pace of development and deployment that we would need for adaptation and mitigation responses to accelerate transitions within different scales? And importantly, also there's now a focus on particularly the urban communities, and given that by the end, this is the century of the city, this focus on what happens within cities, but also food production has been highlighted. And finally, the last 2 points that are highlighted there are options for implementing far-reaching and rapid change and the enabling environments that would create that. And again, a return to our original plea for case studies for implementation in different scales. And I think the meeting at the IPCC had also concluded with a call for imagination and a call for a way to engage thinking and action across all scales, And I think that is something that the social sciences and humanities can bring. As Ioan and Petra have already mentioned, it's the how can we do this? And what was most moving to me about the IPCC meeting was the way in which scientists from all disciplines actually responded to a very difficult issue and didn't just say, this is too hard, this is a distraction, this isn't what I normally do, and actually rose to, well, how can we do this? How can we, what are the options, what do we already know? And I think in that spirit, I think most people came out of the IPCC meetings, and I think certainly now looking at what came out of Bangkok, with a cautious sense of optimism might be too strong, but hope that we can actually look more significantly at these changes and what they mean at the local scale, and that's what the 1.5 gives you, the fine grain to think about how this affects people's lives in their current situations now. And I think that is something that social scientists have something valuable to say.
Great. Thank you so much, Bronwyn. That's great. Let me very much turn over to the questions. I've been tracking them, and I want to, before I hand some of them over to our panelists, I want to very quickly respond to some of the easy ones. Yes, there will be a recording made available afterwards, and we will try to get this up as soon as possible. That takes care of about like 4 questions right there. There was also a question about opportunities for early career scientists to get involved, and maybe I can answer this just from the point of view of having been part of the selection of experts that we brought into the process. So there was quite a bit of attention paid to having people become, as you've now seen represented even in this panel, people who have long-standing IPCC experience and people who are entirely new to this process. Doesn't necessarily mean that they're early career. There needs to be some sense to reassure the Bureau and the steering committee that there is deep understanding, extensive understanding of a number of the issues, given the interdisciplinarity of the issues that we're facing. So I would say if there is an early career scientist who has that kind of depth and who can make those connections across disciplines, absolutely a possibility to be part of it. So there is some effort to bring people in who have not been part of this before, and then there's this balancing act that needs to be met. So with that, I want to actually move us to, I don't know if you can see my slide again. Can we move on to the next one? Can you see it, or am I? I'm not sure you can see my slides. Anyway, it's not important. Let me simply, at this moment, point you to some of the questions that we have received. One of them had to do with, let me try to find it from Sven. Let me make sure I get the question right here. Let me just read it to you, and maybe I can direct this toward Frank. Sven Harmeling here from CARE International. Thanks for great presentations. It will be important for the report not to be confined just by mainstreaming thinking of what seems to be politically realistic now, but to think out of the box and discuss what is necessary to keep us below 1.5 degrees, including through rapid ways to zero emissions rather than looking at scenarios which put too much emphasis on compensating emissions through negative emission technologies. So the question really is, what policy measures can scale up the positive examples that are out there, and also the sustainability or sustainable development benefits of such rapid reductions. In terms of equality, it will be crucial to use the risks for and capacities of the poorest and the most vulnerable countries and communities as a starting point. Do you think the report will address this adequately, but research is still needed to make this case? What research is still needed to make this case? And so maybe Frank start, and Petra, maybe you could comment as well. I can't hear Frank. Are you muted, Frank?
I'm unmuted now, yeah.
Okay, great.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Well, that's a very good question, very difficult one, but one of the most profound ones, I think, because it's by now, I think, increasingly well known that yes, we need the models and they are very important, but they also have limitations. They did not see certain things coming. Of course, solar and PVs are obvious examples, but also they miss all the local stuff that's going on at the city level, at the regional level, community level, which was already flagged up in the previous IPCC report. I just find it difficult to come up with an assessment of how important this was. So I do think this should be one of the issues that this special report pays attention to. And your question about how can we scale this up? How can we make sure this accelerates? That's a really good one. I think we need more. There are lots of local projects going on that are often not so much aware of each other. So in the UK we've got like hundreds of different transition town projects and community energy projects. They all seem to reinvent the wheel. There's not a strong network that connects them together, that makes sure that the experiences and the knowledge in one project circulate to another, that findings are being aggregated so we don't all reinvent the wheel. And quite importantly, that actually this body of all these local projects, that they form, let's say, a spokesperson at a more aggregate level that can lobby further to the policymakers. Because policymakers know there's a lot going on, but as I tried to show in my presentation, they will not really facilitate that further unless they're being pushed and lobbied. So there needs to be more organizational capacity between the projects to create an association that speaks on their behalf and that can then talk to the policymakers. So I think those are the kind of processes that are going on. They need to be studied better. On the other hand, I think we also need stronger selection policies that put pressure. So when on the one hand stimulate the solutions, we also need to tighten the pressure on the existing regimes, the fossil fuels, the oil and the cars. So stronger policies, taxes, regulations, that's of course very difficult, and they are partly interacting with each other. If those existing systems go down, that creates more space for the novelties to emerge. So those are the two sides I think that we should address in the special report.
Great. Let me put one question to Bronwyn that has come in from Christopher Lyon. He asks you, Bronwyn, how robust does our knowledge need to be before we act? How high level of uncertainty suggests that robust is elusive under short, urgent time periods? Does the pursuit of robust limit experimentation?
I think those who've worked within the IPCC will know better than I how to accept the evidence. There was certainly debate, which Petra led actually, about considering material that's in the public domain now that is grey material peer-reviewed. I'm not sure what the date will have to be for material to be included. What is the date for publication? This isn't quite answering the question, but it's a really practical issue that I think it's important for social scientists to think about. Is yes, of course, one of the replies would be that we can waste a lot of time researching things when it's important to take action. But on the other hand, this is the role of the IPCC, is to report on research and to provide strong evidence. And I can understand the concern that the IPCC has had for a significant period of time to protect their sense of integrity, that they are arguing as strongly as they can on the basis of on the strongest evidence that they can marshal to provide information that is relevant and helpful for those who want to then take action. And I think for me and for many political scientists, you can understand that tension. And I think that isn't to not answer the question, but to say that there are two roles. One role is to provide the strongest evidence that we can, and also then the second question is how do we use that evidence. But Susi, are you able to let listeners know what the cut-off date is for being in the public realm?
Yes, I can. Actually, let me move us to this one slide, which will also answer about 6 other questions that I've received in the meantime. And I just want to make sure people have a chance to see this before we get to the top of the hour. So there are many opportunities to be part of the process from here on out and to contribute in a number of ways. So the way nominations for experts work with the IPCC is that every country has a focal point and one entity that basically is the point of contact, and from that point of contact, in the U.S., for example, it's with the U.S. Global Change Research Program, other countries have different points of contact. So you have to find out where is that point of contact for you. They will issue a call for nominations for experts now contributing to the outline as it stands. And there will be calls for convening lead authors, and review editors, all of which have different roles to play in it. But basically, you would be nominated to the IPCC through that country focal point. And once you are nominated and selected, the most important thing is not just to show up, but to be an active author. And what I mean by that is to keep putting the issues on the table, to keep pushing back, not leave the table until it is taken seriously. It's one of the key lessons I've learned as an ISSC member, that you have to really keep fighting back against some pretty antiquated ideas about objective natural science and subjective normative social science, which is just not true. But that is among many people still a guiding myth. So that is important. Another piece, what it means to be an active author, is when you don't have all the expertise, and none of us do, right? We have to elicit the input from other experts. Just in my role, I have called on this set of panelists that you see here, and then additional ones from India and Kenya and whatnot, to basically give input when there were critical questions that I needed quick answers to. And it's been just an amazing collaboration, and I really want to thank all of you for helping with that. So bringing the expertise that you know is necessary to the process. In terms of publishing relevant research, the IPCC is on an incredibly fast timeline, as I pointed out. Any of the literature it wants to review need to be submitted for publication by October 2017, that is in a year from now, in order to be included in the review of the second order draft, and then they must be accepted for publication by April 2018. So again, very rapid turnaround to get published literature into it. Whether or not you have case examples that are compiled, it doesn't all have to be peer-reviewed literature. It can be gray literature. The IPCC now has processes for incorporating that, but it needs to be known by somebody. And so often gray literature is much more difficult to access. So make sure if you have those kinds of compilations or gray literature reports that you bring them into or bring them to the attention of people who are authors. Check out who will be the authors so that you can send those kinds of documents to them. What would help is if that research actually was explicitly relating to or making reference to 1.5 degrees, because they will use search algorithm, and some things that are about rapid social change that is highly relevant might not mention that and might be missed, and that's a big problem. I'm aware of at least a couple of special issues that are in the process of compiling relevant literature. COSIST will have the current opinion in environmental sustainability will have a special issue. I've heard of another one, Elementa, that is hoping to do that. Peter Frumhoff, I believe, who is on this webinar, is one of the co-editors of that. So I encourage you to get in touch with those journals to find out about what the opportunities are. There's also work underway to make rapid funding available for people to do more research in this short amount of time. Climate Works Foundation is going to put out some funding. Norface and Belmont Forum have a call out for research on transformation. Once the drafts are in existence, we will need experts to review it. It's a critical opportunity to provide input into those documents. So if you want to follow it closely at the link that I provide here, or just simply Google IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees and you will find it. So those are the immediate opportunities for contributing to that. And I know there are some other questions that we did not get to. I will go through those and maybe collect answers from our panelists to make sure that we answer those, and we will make those answers and recording of the webinar available at the website worldsocialscience.org, and that will be within just a few days. So hopefully that will be of great interest to those of you who who posed questions or who couldn't be on this call. I want to thank all the panelists for setting us up, to Sarah Moore for making sure that all the technicalities worked, and thank you so much for being part of this from all over the world. And please do contribute. It's an incredibly important process. Thank you very much. Goodbye.